Hello, my name is Wesley Lawton, and I am one of the co-facilitators for the Men Overcoming Loss Grief Support Group. There's a lot going on right now in our country, in our world, in our society. Things are changing every hour, it seems like, and we are meeting the needs of those who have recently lost loved ones. And that doesn't stop for times like this. And so we're going to keep doing what we're doing. In fact, we're going to continue to offer this group virtually. We're going to continue posting these videos. And Hospice of Michigan and Arbor Hospice, kind of partners in crime here, are going to be also doing groups virtually. Lots of them, lots of choices. And so for information on those, you'll be able to go to HOM or hospiceofmichigan.org. Or I believe arborhospice.org. I'm on the Hospice of Michigan side of things, but if you Google Arbor Hospice, I'm sure it will come up. I should probably know that information before I hit record. Anyway, let's get into the material from this last, I guess it was earlier this week's, man, time is doing funny things right now, Men Overcoming Loss group. And this one was about cultural expectations of men in grief. So let me pull that up here. And share. Okay. So we are talking about cultural expectations of men. The title, I think, is important. We're not talking necessarily about the way that men are or the way that you are supposed to be, really. In fact, the point is kind of the opposite. It's that these are the expectations that Western American society in the 21st century and in the 20th century as well often puts on men. These are stereotypes, so to speak. And these are things that you probably have felt, perhaps messages that you've got from childhood that you have carried with you and that may have changed a little bit over time. Not all of these, as always, are going to apply to every guy out there, but I think that many of them are ones that you will identify with. And the reason that we talk about this is that it's important to name these things, to identify them, to say, hey, I guess I have been feeling this, because if you're not aware of it, then it's got control over you and you can't really do anything about it. But if you are aware, if you're mindful of it, then you can kind of separate it from yourself a little bit if you need to, and say, you know what, maybe I don't need to do it this way. And then it frees you up to find new ways to grieve that are healthier. That's the way that I see it anyway. The reason that we're doing this the way that we're doing it. So cultural expectations. Let's talk first about some things that men in our society often are expected to do and to be. So the first one we've got here is to be in control. There's something ingrained in our society and in many of our families where men in particular, if you are a grieving husband, father, son, whatever it may be, many others are looking to you to be in control of situations outside of yourself, as well as your own inner life, to be in control, to have that dominance. And one thing we know about the grief process, that I know even just from working with people, even if I didn't know any research, all you have to do is encounter somebody grieving, and one of the most common things for men and women is that you feel out of control, not only with how you are feeling now. The tears may come at very inconvenient times. You may be feeling things that you wish you weren't feeling, but also at the end of your loved one's life, there may have been some situations where you felt very out of control, and those may be some things that are still on your mind. So that may not quite match up with the expectations that you've been feeling, to be in control. Another one is to be confident. That's something that's really prized in our society, for men and increasingly women, of course, but certainly for men, it's always been that way, at least for a very long time. That confidence is prized. We want confidence in our leaders, in our friends, in our associates, people we work with. And sometimes you don't feel very confident. You may have no idea what you're doing when it comes to this grieving thing. And that is really the normal way to be. There's no smooth way to do it. You're not supposed to know exactly what's coming next. That's sort of the nature of it from what I've seen. Men in our society are often expected to be more concerned with thinking than feeling. This is kind of, again, a stereotype of masculinity that men are supposed to not really have as strong of feelings, not supposed to express as strong of feelings as women, and that they're supposed to be focused on, rational thought, logic. There are great men in history who have, I think about the Enlightenment period in history, and this concept of rational, logical thought, and it brought us into the modern era. But that's not really where grief often lives. That's not how we feel it. There are certain things that you're probably thinking and feeling that simply don't make sense. Guilt is one that comes to mind. The vast majority of guilt that the bereaved feel is not rational. Often it's, I should have done something differently. I should, somehow this was my fault. I shouldn't be healing in this way. I'm forgetting about them. And if you really look at these things and analyze them, you find that they actually don't make sense. But even after you discover that, you may still feel that guilt. There are lots of examples of things like that where the grief experience is simply not something that, it's not a puzzle that you can solve. It's something that you feel and that you go through. And that may not line up with your identity as a man because of the projections that society may have put on you throughout your life up to this point. Expected to be rational and analytical. I guess we already talked a little bit about that. So the last point was more about focusing on thinking and maybe more about the disconnection from our feelings. But this is about a particular kind of thought. And I have found that grieving people benefit from being able to let go of the rational and analytical mind. And that's not really something that most of us are used to, especially men. Men in our society are expected to be assertive. Again, this is like confidence. And there are many men out there who are not confident or assertive, and we know this. But these things are really prized. The sort of ideal man in a lot of people's minds, maybe in your own mind about yourself, is that if you're a masculine man, a manly man, you are confident and you are assertive, and that is a part of being a man. Again, you might not feel that way. You might not know what your needs are, how to assert them. Moving on to being courageous. And you may feel pretty scared a lot of times, if we're honest. I mean, feeling fear is not an emotion that a lot of guys are comfortable bringing up or talking about or admitting, but it's one of the most common things to feel when you're grieving. You don't know how life is going to go on now. You don't know how you're going to go on, and maybe even who you are. That's a pretty terrifying thing if we're honest about it. But the fact that we feel the pressure to be courageous makes it harder to talk about that and to work through it. Often expected to be competitive and rivalrous. We can think back, this is something that I think is one of the easiest to identify for boys growing up, certainly for myself, and I know my colleague Will, who co-facilitates this group. He has shared a couple of examples of remembering back to his childhood and picking team members for baseball or dodgeball or whatever it might be. And if we think about that kind of an image, again, maybe especially from our own childhoods years ago, it's something that you picture boys playing together with other boys oftentimes. And again, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but this is just sort of the reality of the way that society is, and that you may identify as a man and as a person. Expected to accomplish tasks and achieve goals. So this is sort of another example of a way that, grief doesn't really work this way. There are lots of models of grief out there. You may have heard of, the 5 stages or some different tasks related to grief. Some of these different ideas of the way that it works. And it can be helpful to think about it that way because grief is an active thing. It's something that you need to do intentionally in order to work through it. It's not something that just sort of passes with time. You need to work through some things. And so there is action there. There are tasks that you complete. However, it may not feel that way. It's not like a nice checklist or an Excel sheet or anything like that. It's not, a lot of times may not feel like you're doing much. And so, and sometimes, time is an important ingredient in that too. So sometimes you can work and not, you feel like you're running on a hamster wheel. Men in our society are expected to be knowledgeable about how mechanical things work. And in terms of how this applies to grief, I think about my own self and my relationship to my wife. And if something were to happen to her, God forbid anytime soon, she is actually more hands-on with mechanical things in most areas. It's kind of 50-50 with us. Neither of us is a wizard at it, but she does a little bit more of that stuff than I do. And I would have a hard time admitting that to people if I needed a little help with stuff like that. And if anything, I would feel like, I should be the independent one who's able to fix such and such. And even now, with both of us being still living, sometimes kind of hard to ask for help with fixing up the car or whatever. And so some of you may identify with that. It gets easier the more that you do it in terms of asking for help or in terms of practicing. Hopefully I'm getting a little better. It's a skill we can develop, but again, we're not all there. And endure stress without giving up. And you may feel like giving up sometimes. Again, this is stuff, we don't want to just push this down or ignore it. If it's there, we got to name it, we got to work through it. Okay, I'll move a little quicker through some of these other ones that we're expected to do. We're expected to express anger. As I said in our group this last time, I think from what I've observed and from what I've learned, little boys historically have been encouraged to express anger, and that they are expected to express anger more than other feelings. Maybe happiness is okay, and it always depends on your family. This isn't true for many of us, but feelings such as sadness or fear or sometimes even excitement, or it can fill in the blank. I guess loneliness, or there are all kinds of examples of things that are expected of little girls more than little boys oftentimes. And again, these are messages that we carry with us. And how that turns out in adulthood a lot of times is you may feel sadness or fear or any number of feelings. Trying to think of another one: uncertainty, other common ones in grief, guilt, that's another one. And it may come out as anger because that's what you've been most comfortable with for your whole life. And so it's important often to examine and ask, is there something behind the anger? Pain. Oh, that's one I was trying to think of. Very common one that is behind anger is pain. And so it's good to ask yourself, is this just hurt that is coming out as anger because I'm not comfortable talking about or feeling that hurt? Or again, the fear, the sadness, whatever it might be for you. Men are expected to be able to bear pain, and it may feel overwhelming sometimes. And it can be hard to bring that up. Be able to hold his liquor. And what this makes me think of is the fact, it's a simple statistic that men are much more likely than women to try to cope with grief, or I would say avoid grief, through alcohol use and other substance use. And so that may be more socially acceptable for men. And so we might not get people intervening in our lives to try to help us out with that. Men are expected to settle down at an appropriate age to be a husband and father, and you may find yourself newly bereaved in whatever situation, and that can impact that sort of social clock that you may not be keeping up with for whatever reason. And that can bring up all kinds of secondary things. Men are expected to be providers. And again, depending on your situation, now that you've lost your loved one, it can definitely be impacted as far as what you're able to do or what you feel responsible to do, what the expectation is on you. Okay. Men in our society are not expected to lose control of a situation or himself. Some of these are really the converse of some of the things we talked about a little while ago. So just briefly, we can sometimes feel very out of control of our situation and of ourselves when we're grieving in particular. And we may not know how to handle that, how to think of that. That may not really compute or fit into like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole in our mind in the way that we think about ourselves. And so we may need to examine that. This is a big one. for a lot of guys and a lot of women too, but I would say even more so for most men, not expected to openly cry, or sometimes to cry at all. We don't really think of, many of us don't think of our dads or our grandfathers, our uncles, or our male leaders in our lives as expressing tears. We're expected to kind of hold that back around people. And so we take that on ourselves as well. Again, I think this is hopefully something that's changing a little bit as time goes on and generations go on. But for many men of my generation and younger, it's still the case. It's not considered to be a manly thing. And if you do it, you're supposed to hide it, but it's not often realistic. And it's actually healthiest, I believe, that when the tears come, to simply let them out, to not put a huge stigma or judgment on them, but just to recognize that this is a part of you adapting to life as it is now without your loved one after your loss. Often expected or not to expected to be afraid. We talked a little bit about that. To be dependent. And again, this is another big one, because support is one of the most important protective factors after a loss. If you have people around you who are willing to support you in a multitude of ways, you're much more likely to be okay and to work through it a little more quickly and smoothly and easily than those who have nobody. And some of us do have nobody. And it's one of the reasons that we provide support groups for those who have nobody, or for those who could use a little extra support, maybe different support than they have. But it can be hard to ask for help, especially for men. I wonder sometimes if that's part of why there's the need for this group. Because most of our groups, we don't have a women's only group, because the vast majority of people showing up to our co-ed groups are women anyway. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. Men are often not expected to be insecure or anxious. These are some other feelings where it's really the opposite of confidence or assertiveness. And a lot of times we don't know who we are at a given moment, how we're supposed to be, what's going to happen, if we're going to be okay. And there can be a stigma around admitting that. Not expected to be passive, expected to just sort of handle things. What can I do? How can I fix this? Men are often expected to be fixers. And you may not feel, a lot of times in grief, there's really, again, nothing really to fix. So much of it is just something that you have to go through, and that can be difficult. Men are not expected to express loneliness, sadness, and depression. Again, we talked about how oftentimes anger is the big one, the sort of negative emotion that we're most comfortable with. And there may be other things behind that. It can be harder to kind of dig into those things, but they're there, and so we need to acknowledge them. Not expected to express the need for love and affection. You may be more isolated or less supported now than you have been before for a number of reasons. Maybe your spouse died and some of your friends are drifting, or whatever it might be. And we need that love and affection, companionship, community. We still need physical touch as human beings. Hugs and handshakes. Maybe the hand on our face, whatever it may be. Those needs have always been there, and they're still there, but they don't come by as easily for many men. Not expected to be playful, and that might have to do in terms of grief with humor, or with having fun. And it's important to have those things as you're working through grief, or maybe to rediscover those things, to be kind of silly once in a while, to have a sort of lightness about life during this very heavy experience and season that you're in. Exhibit typically feminine characteristics, and you can fill in the blank for what that is in your mind and your family and culture. I think often of being caring and empathetic, or of again being very expressive of emotions. These are things that I associate with femininity, and I think we all have sort of a masculine side and a feminine side, and a lot of men have more masculinity than femininity. But you know what? We've all got some of both inside of us. And so some of those things you associate with being feminine might be important to examine and ask, is this a tool in my toolbox that can be helpful? To touch other men, again, we talked about affection, and unfortunately that's something more and more, even as we get more, I think, open as a society to men expressing feelings and tears. I would say that physical touch is still sort of a taboo for a lot of guys. I think about growing up as a child and a teenager, and girls were often, walking, holding hands, or sitting on one another's laps, or whatever, just being close. And the guys were not. There was a lot of, I guess, anti that behavior, and that carries out, even though it's maybe less dramatic into adulthood. It's just sort of the expectation, I guess, that closeness isn't there. Not expected to be impotent, to be powerless, to be ineffective. And you can often feel that way in grief. Okay, I guess that's it. So those are some expectations. And again, the point of going through all of these is I encourage you to take a moment and to think. Maybe you need to rewind the video a little bit, or scroll back, I guess, as it's called now, and examine, is this something that I identify with? And is this something that's been causing me problems? Because the fact is that we are men, we're first and foremost human beings. And the way that society defines manhood, or the way that you may identify yourself, you may not have to do it that way. And in fact, that may not line up with the reality of what you're actually going through. And the important thing is to take stock, take inventory of what's actually happening in you and around you, and how you're responding to it, and to be realistic about it, and to be ideally open about it with others in your life, so that you can work through it, get to a place where it's not so overwhelming. It may not be bothering you or causing you as much pain. And you can start to have more good days than bad days. That's kind of when you know that you're really healing from grief and loss. And so just want to encourage you and plug the fact that these videos are really recaps of some of the things that happen live. And especially these days, live doesn't always mean face-to-face, in person, even though I love when we're able to do that. But right now, we're going all virtual. We are over video chat and over the phone. Of course, you can imagine with the slides, video chat is kind of nice to be able to do if you've got that on your laptop or your mobile device. But if you feel more comfortable, whether it's the technology or whatever, just dialing in, that's an option too. So talk very briefly about how those things happen. It is the third Tuesday of every month. So first, let me just give you an idea of why it can be helpful to join live. You can get specific feedback. You can ask a question. We always allot time at the end of the presentation and throughout the presentation to ask, how does this apply to you? What are you going through? What challenges are you facing? Especially if it's related to what we're talking about. But sometimes things come up and it's like, I just gotta address this with somebody, and maybe feel most comfortable doing that with other guys. So you might want to join this group. And Will and I are both counselors, licensed, and we both have quite a bit of experience. Will more than me, but I am gaining more in working with bereaved individuals, and have learned a lot from that. And so whether it's us or other guys walking a similar road, you can get feedback on what you're going through. Participate in others' grief journeys. That can be a satisfying thing, and often you benefit from that as much as they do. And it's always good to support each other, to help each other. We need each other. As much as we may value independence, now is the time when we need to rely on others, even more than ever. Benefits, there's the healing group dynamic. And this is something that therapists, mental health professionals have identified, that groups are really just as effective as individual therapy for most situations. And part of that is that you may not be getting the individual attention of a mental health professional, but there's something about connecting with other people, especially people who are going through something similar to you, that is helpful. And so you can get this information and this education through watching these videos, and I hope that that's helpful. I believe it could be. But I encourage you, if you can, to kind of take that extra step and to interact. Again, research is showing us that therapy, which this isn't a therapeutic group, but support groups as well, but they're just as effective over video chat, or just about as effective as they are in person. And so I encourage you to connect with us and to facilitate your continued healing. So here's how you join. HOM.org/virtual touch. And I won't walk through each one of these, but it is the third Tuesday of every month from 6 to 7 p.m. Again, Hospice of Michigan is going to be adding other groups if that time is not convenient for you, or if doing a men overcoming loss group isn't ideal for you, you want to do something with women too, and get that feedback and those connections, or we have a couple of other specific groups available. And so go to hom.org/virtual-touch, and you may need to put that extra slash at the end. And then join via Zoom or telephone, as you can see. If you have any questions, if you want to connect with us, you can email me at wlawton, so WLAWTON @HOM.org, or you can contact Will at wgasper, so that's WGASPER @HOM.org, and ask questions or register for the group or whatever you may need. We're here to support you however we can. So let me go ahead and stop sharing the screen. Okay, so thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it's helpful. You can, from that virtual touch page that I mentioned, you can click a link to look at our archive of videos, and there are some other topics that you may also find helpful. We're going to be continuing to do these once a month, hopefully, and we're certainly planning to. A lot of things are up in the air right now, but we're definitely planning on continuing this, and so stay tuned. And if you can't join us in person, then hopefully you also benefit from these videos. Okay, so thank you, take good care, and hope to connect with you soon.